At 8,600 meters on Everest, a climber goes blind without warning. Moments later, his hands and legs stop obeying orders, stranded, alive, but already doomed. The world knows the mountain kills, but in these stories, the killers are inside. Vision vanishes, hearts collapse, brains swell, lungs flood, until even survival instincts betray their owners. How does the strongest body decide to self-destruct when rescue is just meters away? The answer will redefine how you judge risk on Everest. Thomas Weber began his summit push on Everest's north side just after midnight, moving steadily upward into the thinning air above 8,500 meters. For most climbers, the world narrows to the crunch of crampons and the hiss of an oxygen mask. For Weber, it narrowed to darkness. As he climbed higher, his vision began to fade, not just blur, but dissolve. The retina, starved of oxygen, could no longer process the faint blue of the snow or the thin shadow of a rope. Above 8,600 meters, Weber's world went completely black. His guide radioed down. Thomas Weber went completely blind. Blindness at this altitude is not just loss of sight. It is the erasure of every tool a climber needs to survive. Without vision, every step becomes a guess. The brain, already slowed by hypoxia, cannot compensate for the missing input. Foot placement turns from instinct to uncertainty. The fixed ropes, a lifeline on Everest's knife-edge ridges, become impossible to locate or clip. Small tasks, clipping a carabiner, adjusting a crampon, slip out of reach. Sherpas described Weber staggering, his arms flailing for purchase, his feet dragging as if the mountain itself pulled him down. High-altitude retinopathy, a direct result of oxygen deprivation, is rarely discussed outside medical circles, but for Weber, it was the first domino. The retina's collapse triggered a chain reaction. Proprioception, the body's sense of position, depends on visual feedback. Without it, balance fails. Motor errors multiply. At 8,700 meters, Weber's legs felt leaden. His hands, numb and slow, could not obey even the simplest commands. The body that had carried him across continents now refused to answer. Blindness in the death zone is not just a symptom, it is a verdict. The ability to self-rescue disappears. Even with a guide at his side, Weber's chances fell to zero. Above 8,500 meters, there is no margin for error. The mountain's margin for mercy is even thinner. Early warning signs, blurred vision, trouble tracking a rope, are the last signals a climber receives before the body's systems begin to unravel. Turnaround advice is clear in hindsight. Any loss of vision at altitude should end the climb immediately, but in the moment, with the summit so close, the line between ambition and disaster vanishes. Weber's blindness was the start of a cascade that would make descent impossible. The mountain did not kill him directly. His own body, betrayed by the simple need for oxygen, did the rest. At 8,700 meters, the body's last reserves vanish with startling speed. Glycogen, the fuel that powers every muscle contraction, runs critically low in the death zone. Weber's legs, already heavy from the effort of climbing blind, now move as if through wet cement. The body tries to compensate by shivering, a reflex meant to generate heat from whatever energy remains. But at this altitude, the shivering response itself begins to fail. Core temperature drops by just over a degree. 1.2 degrees Celsius is enough to slow nerve conduction and make even simple movements feel impossible. Hypoxia and cold combine to strip away the body's defenses. The hands, numb and clumsy, lose their grip. The feet drag with each step, unable to find solid purchase. Even breathing becomes a conscious battle as the muscles that drive respiration grow weaker. The brain, desperate for oxygen, starts to ration energy. Non-essential functions, like fine motor skills and short-term memory, are the first to go. What remains is a shell of instinct and will, but without fuel, neither can last. Sherpas and guides have learned to recognize the signs. A climber who stops shivering, who seems oddly calm as the wind cuts through down layers, who can no longer clip into a rope or adjust a harness. These are signals that the body's thermostat has failed. In the death zone, once warmth is lost, it cannot be regained. Resting is no refuge, circulation slows, core temperature sinks further, and the spiral tightens. Weber's collapse at 8,700 meters was not a sudden event, but the endpoint of a long, invisible slide. The body's warning systems, dulled by altitude, gave no clear alarm. By the time exhaustion set in, the margin for rescue was already gone. Guides stress a strict turnaround at the first hint of sensory failure, because every minute spent above 8,500 meters drains the last of the body's energy and heat. Weber's final moments, still, silent, and cold, are a lesson written in physiology. On Everest, it is not always the mountain that kills. Sometimes, the body simply runs out of what it needs to survive. At 8,400 meters, Dr. Niels Antizana's mind began to slip away from him. The summit was behind him, but his brain was running out of oxygen with every shallow breath. Climbers in the death zone often describe a strange, creeping confusion. Names and numbers vanish, directions blur, and the simplest tasks become unsolvable puzzles. For Antizana, a trained physician, the warning signs were there. Losing track of his pace, uncertain of the route, pausing mid-step as if the mountain itself had erased his memory. Oxygen pressure in the blood at this altitude drops to around 45 millimeters of mercury, barely half of what the brain needs to stay alert. With each minute, his neurons fired more slowly. Decision-making, navigation, even the sense of up and down, all began to break apart. The body's internal compass, so reliable at lower altitudes, spun wildly. Antizana's companions noticed him wandering off the established path, struggling to follow the fixed ropes, and stopping for long, blank stares into the void. Episodes of lost consciousness, sometimes just a few seconds, sometimes longer, are common in severe hypoxia. The mind flickers in and out, unable to process the danger. At the balcony, a narrow shelf at 8,400 meters, Antizana collapsed. He was not the first climber to reach this invisible wall, but what made his case so stark was the way his brain betrayed him before his body had fully given up. The will to keep moving remained, but the machinery that controlled his limbs and thoughts was shutting down. In the field, doctors use blood gas measurements to track oxygen deprivation. But on Everest, there are no monitors, only the red flags of behavior. Disorientation, confusion, and repeated stops signal that the brain is starving. By the time Antizana's legs folded beneath him, his cognitive reserve was gone. Even with help, he could not coordinate enough movement to descend. The balcony became his final boundary, a place where the mind's last defenses crumbled in the thin air. Above 8,000 meters, the brain's need for oxygen is absolute. When supply drops below the threshold, no amount of training or determination can compensate. Antizana's collapse is remembered not just for its tragedy, but as a lesson. The danger is not always dramatic. Sometimes, the first sign is a lost sense of direction, a blank stare, a climber pausing on the rope, signals that the brain's oxygen crisis has already begun. At 69 years old, Dr. Niels Antizana entered Everest's death zone, carrying decades of medical experience and the quiet penalties of age. Above 8,000 meters, the body's oxygen processing capacity shrinks with every birthday. For climbers in their late 60s, VO2 max, the maximum rate of oxygen uptake, can fall by 30% or more compared to younger athletes. At that altitude, where the air holds only a third of the oxygen found at sea level, this deficit is not just a number. It means every step costs more, and every recovery takes longer, even when the will to move remains strong. Dehydration compounds the problem. The dry, frigid air strips away moisture with each exhale, and the body loses water through sweat that never feels wet in the cold. By the time a climber reaches the balcony at 8,400 meters, it's common to be down by 7% of total body weight in fluids. That's enough to thicken the blood, slow circulation, and make the heart work harder to push what little oxygen remains. Thirst, blunted by altitude, rarely signals the danger in time. Sherpas have learned to watch for the telltale signs: lips cracked, speech slurred, movement sluggish. One described the sensation as lead legs, the point where muscles refuse to answer, no matter how clear the mind's command. The older the climber, the narrower the margin for error. Cardiovascular reserve, how much extra work the heart can do in a crisis declines steadily with age. At 69, Antizana's heart and lungs could not compensate for the losses inflicted by the mountain. The safety buffer that might let a younger climber recover from a stumble or a pause simply wasn't there. Each delay, each moment of rest, drained his remaining reserves further. In the death zone, stopping is not a chance to recover, but a slide toward collapse. Modern expedition doctors now urge strict hydration schedules, even when climbers don't feel thirsty. They recommend pacing strategies that account for age, with longer acclimatization and mandatory oxygen above 8,000 meters. But in 2004, Antizana's generation often relied on experience and determination, qualities that, in the death zone, become irrelevant when physiology runs out. His collapse near the balcony was not a single failure, but the final domino in a chain of shrinking reserves. Less oxygen, less water, less time. The body, stripped of every backup system, could go no further. Everest's death zone does not forgive those who run out of margin, and for older climbers, that margin is always vanishingly thin. Alexander Mitchell Kellis set out across the Tibetan Plateau in the autumn of 1921, leading the scientific vanguard of the first British reconnaissance of Everest. The route to the mountain itself was a journey of attrition, 120 kilometers on foot at altitudes that never dropped below 4,500 meters. Each day, the team covered long distances with packs on their backs, sleeping in canvas tents pitched on frozen ground, and eating what little the expedition could carry or barter from local villagers. The available rations provided less than 1,800 kilocalories per day, a severe shortfall for men burning far more just to keep moving and stay warm. Kellis, already 53, was no stranger to the effects of altitude. He had spent years studying how oxygen scarcity challenged the human body, but the demands of the approach, long marches, relentless cold, and thin air pushed even his expertise to the edge. Heart rates surged to 140 beats per minute during the steepest sections, a level more typical of a hard sprint at sea level than a sustained walk. The cold and wind made every calorie count, yet the expedition's diet could not replenish what the body lost. Each day, the deficit grew, and with it, the strain on every organ system. Warning signs on the plateau are subtle. Fatigue becomes a constant companion, but in the context of a Himalayan expedition, it is easy to dismiss as part of the challenge. Shortness of breath, chest tightness, and a racing pulse blend into the daily grind of high-altitude trekking. Kellis, focused on the science and logistics of the mission, kept moving forward. The body's signals, an elevated pulse, a gnawing hunger that never quite goes away, restless nights, were chalked up to the hardship of the journey, not the first hints of something more dangerous. In these conditions, the line between normal exhaustion and looming cardiac trouble blurs. The heart, forced to pump harder and faster in the thin air, faces an invisible battle. Without enough oxygen, every tissue demands more from an organ already working at its limit. Over days, the cumulative effect of underfeeding, overexertion, and constant hypoxia wears down even the strongest physiology. Kellis was not the only member of the team to struggle, but as the days wore on, his resilience was quietly eroding. Modern climbers now track calories and monitor heart rates as early warning systems. In 1921, these tools did not exist. The only metrics were how far you could walk and whether you could keep up with the group. For Kellis, the silent toll of the approach was masked by the daily rhythm of the expedition. The mountain was still on the horizon, but the real danger had already begun, one step at a time, as the body's reserves dwindled unnoticed. Alexander Mitchell Kellis was found lifeless on the stony ground near Kambadzong, not far from the shadow of Everest. His death, recorded on September 16, 1921, struck his team with a kind of stunned disbelief. This was a man who had spent his life unraveling the mysteries of altitude, who knew the risks of oxygen deprivation better than anyone. Yet even Kellis, with all his knowledge, could not see the danger that was quietly building inside his chest. The expedition doctor's notes, written in a cramped hand, mentioned sudden heart failure, Later sketches and medical reviews point to ventricular hypertrophy, a thickening of the heart muscle that, under the relentless strain of hypoxia, can turn deadly. At nearly 5,000 meters, the air holds only half the oxygen of sea level. Each heartbeat pushes against higher resistance, and the heart, already enlarged from years of adaptation and exertion, is forced into overdrive. It is here that the invisible line is crossed, cells starved of oxygen, electrical signals faltering, a fatal arrhythmia triggered in an instant. Modern cardiologists, reviewing cases like Kellis, warn that chronic hypoxia is a powerful arrhythmia trigger. Dr. Peter Hackett, an expert in high-altitude medicine, once explained, "The heart at altitude is under constant stress. If there's any underlying weakness, the risk of sudden failure rises sharply." For Kellis, the combination of cold, exhaustion, and low oxygen likely set off a cascade, rapid, unheralded, and final. There were no monitors or warning alarms in 1921. The only clues were a racing pulse and a sense of fatigue that never seemed to lift. The expedition's leaders chalked up his symptoms to the grind of the march. But the reality was more insidious. The heart was being pushed past its safe limits, its electrical rhythm growing unstable with every step. When the collapse came, it was swift. There was no time for rescue, no chance for intervention. Today, the lesson is clear to those planning expeditions to extreme altitude. Cardiac screening, especially electrocardiograms and stress tests, can reveal hidden risks long before the mountain does. Ventricular hypertrophy and arrhythmia are not just problems for the old or unfit. They can strike anyone whose heart is forced to work too hard, too long in the thin air. Modern climbers are urged to undergo thorough checks before setting foot on the plateau, not just the mountain. Kellis's fate is a reminder that the body's greatest betrayals are often silent until the very end. Everest's dangers begin far below the summit, and sometimes the first and only warning is the last. Carl Gordon Henize arrived at Everest's advanced base camp with a dry cough and a sense of fatigue that seemed, at first, unremarkable. At 6,700 meters, most climbers expect to feel out of breath. But Henize's symptoms did not fade with rest. The cough deepened, and each breath grew more labored. High-altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE, often begins this way, quietly, with a tickle in the chest and a sense that the air is somehow thinner than it should be. The real danger lies in what happens next. The lungs, starved of oxygen, begin to leak fluid into their own air spaces. Medical teams on Everest have learned to look for the earliest red flags. In Henize's case, a chest X-ray would have shown infiltrates covering nearly a third of his lungs, a sign that fluid was already taking over. Blood oxygen measurements, if available, would have read around 55 millimeters of mercury, far below the threshold for normal function. Supplemental oxygen was brought in, and the team began a cautious descent. But HAPE is a process that, once started, can rarely be reversed with oxygen alone. The fluid in the lungs acts as a barrier, blocking the transfer of oxygen into the bloodstream. Even as Henize's mask delivered pure O2, his body could not absorb enough to keep up with the demand. The early stages of HAPE are often mistaken for simple exhaustion or a stubborn cold. Climbers dismiss the symptoms as the price of high altitude, not realizing that their lungs are betraying them from within. The cough, initially dry and persistent, becomes more pronounced as fluid builds up. Each breath is less efficient than the last. The body compensates by breathing faster, but this only accelerates dehydration and further strains the heart. As the infiltrate spreads, the lungs lose their ability to clear carbon dioxide. The blood becomes more acidic, and the brain, already stressed by low oxygen, begins to falter. For Henize, the decision to descend came too late. The team's oxygen supply bought only a little time. At altitude, the effectiveness of supplemental O2 is limited by the sheer volume of fluid in the lungs. The only true remedy is rapid descent, but every hour spent at high camp allows HAPE to progress. By nightfall, Henize's breathing had grown shallow. The dry cough that signaled the start of his illness had become a warning of what was to come. In the death zone, the the body's own warning system is unreliable. What begins as a cough can end in silence, even as the mind remains aware of every breath that will not come. Night on Everest brings a drop in temperature, but for climbers with HAPI, the greater danger is what happens inside the body as darkness falls. Carl Gordon Heneze lay in his tent at 6,700 meters, breathing shallowly, lungs filling with fluid. In the death zone, the act of sleep itself becomes a gamble. As the body drifts toward rest, the drive to breathe weakens. Ventilation falls by as much as 20% compared to waking hours. For a healthy climber, that drop means more carbon dioxide, a restless night, maybe a headache. For someone with fluid already seeping into the lungs, it is a silent threat that grows more lethal with every minute. Heneze was 66 years old. Decades of scientific achievement in spaceflight had taught him to respect the limits of the human body, but age had quietly narrowed his physiological safety margin. Older climbers lose cardiac reserve, the heart's ability to pump harder in crisis, making it harder to compensate for the stress of altitude. At rest, the aging body cannot summon the same response to falling oxygen levels. As night deepened, Heneze's breathing slowed. The fluid in his lungs thickened, coating the delicate alveoli and blocking oxygen transfer. Each breath delivered less and less of what his body desperately needed. Sherpas who checked on him that evening later described a man who seemed calm but weary, sitting upright to ease the effort of breathing. One said, "He did not complain. He only asked for more water and to be left alone to rest." The signs of HAPI are often mistaken for the ordinary misery of altitude, a cough, fatigue, the urge to sleep. But the real danger is that the body's warning system goes silent just as the crisis accelerates. As Heneze slept, the natural fall in ventilation allowed fluid to accumulate unchecked. The oxygen mask brought some relief, but it could not reverse the underlying leak. Without rapid descent, even the best equipment is only a temporary shield. By morning, Heneze was gone. The team found him still in his sleeping bag, his breathing having faded away in the quiet hours before dawn. The night had offered no mercy. For climbers in the death zone, sleep is not a refuge, it is a risk. The body's own mechanisms, designed for recovery at lower altitudes, become the final betrayer. Age compounds this risk, shrinking the reserve needed to survive even the smallest drop in oxygen. Heneze's death is a warning written in physiology. On Everest, the danger does not pause for rest. The mountain claims its due most often in the dark, when the body's defenses are at their weakest. Dr. Eberhard Schaaf's final hours on Everest began with a subtle, almost invisible warning. At 8,730 meters, just below the south summit, his steps grew unstable. What started as a slight wobble in his gait quickly became unmistakable ataxia, the hallmark sign that the brain's control over the body was slipping. Climbers who watched him described a staggering walk, arms out for balance, boots scraping across the ice as if the ground itself were shifting underfoot. In the death zone, this kind of loss of coordination is not just dangerous, it is a red flag for high-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, a condition where the brain swells against the skull and begins to malfunction. Medical teams on Everest carry dexamethasone, a steroid meant to reduce brain swelling. Schaaf received an 8 milligram dose as his condition worsened, but at this altitude the rules of rescue are unforgiving. His blood sodium, measured at 130 millimoles per liter, was already below normal, a sign that his body's chemistry was unraveling. The swelling in his brain pressed on the nerves that control movement, stripping away the ability to walk, stand, or even remain upright. The classic test, walking heel to toe in a straight line, becomes impossible. Instead, every step is a lurch, every attempt to move a risk of collapse. The immediate medical advice for ataxia at high altitude is simple and absolute. Descend at once. No summit, no matter how close, is worth the risk. But on Everest, turning around is not always an option. The thin air, the exhaustion after a summit push, and the bottleneck of climbers on the fixed ropes all conspire to make evacuation slow or impossible. Schaaf's team recognized the danger, but the mountain offered no margin for delay. Even with treatment underway, his coordination kept deteriorating. The dexamethasone could not reverse the swelling quickly enough, and the lack of oxygen at nearly 8,750 meters means that every minute lost was a minute closer to irreversible brain damage. Ataxia is more than clumsiness. It is the visible sign that the brain's wiring is failing. For Schaff, a trained doctor, the betrayal was especially cruel. He knew the implications of his symptoms, yet could do nothing to stop them. The serum sodium reading, the dose of dexamethasone, the desperate attempts to steady himself. Each fact tells the same story. Once the brain begins to swell at altitude, the only real treatment is rapid descent. On Everest, that is a race most climbers cannot win. Schaff's collapse on the descent is now a case study in how quickly neurological control can vanish, and how the window for rescue closes with every faltering step. Sherpas clipped Dr. Eberhard Schaff into the fixed ropes and tried to lower him down the southeast ridge, but his body had already passed the threshold where rescue is possible. They managed to move him just 50 vertical meters before he became completely unresponsive. At this altitude, a non-ambulatory climber is not just a patient. They become dead weight, often exceeding 100 kilograms with gear. Even the strongest guides, already starved for oxygen, cannot carry that burden for long. Schaff's brain, swollen by more than 12% its normal weight, had lost the ability to control even the most basic movements. No amount of encouragement or medical intervention could reverse that process in the death zone. What happened to Schaff is not an outlier, but a pattern. On Everest, 70% of deaths occur during descent. After the summit, the body's reserves are spent, glycogen is depleted, oxygen is running out, and the cold seeps in. The mind may still urge movement, but the machinery of survival is gone. Even highly trained doctors, well-versed in the signs of cerebral edema, cannot outthink the physics of altitude. The mountain's rules are absolute. If the brain cannot direct the body, there is no rescue. The reality is distilled into a handful of preventive guidelines, now posted in expedition tents and guidebooks. Turnaround times are enforced with a hard edge. If a climber is not past the south summit by a set hour, they must descend, no matter how close the summit appears. Age limits are not written into law, but commercial operators now screen clients over 60 with far greater scrutiny, knowing that cardiovascular reserve shrinks with every passing year. Supplemental oxygen is mandatory for nearly all guided expeditions above 8,000 meters, cutting the risk of fatal edema by as much as 20%. But these measures are only as effective as the willingness to heed them. Schaff's case, and those before him, reveal a deeper lesson. The body's warning system at altitude cannot be trusted. Thirst, hunger, and fatigue are dulled by hypoxia. Climbers often feel functional even as their physiology is in free fall. The checklist, turnaround time, age, oxygen, hydration, is not just a set of recommendations. It is a line between survival and the point of no return. On Everest, the margin is so thin that a single missed signal can be fatal. The mountain's most horrible fate is not a dramatic fall or avalanche, but the slow, silent betrayal of the body itself, when rescue is no longer possible, and the only thing left is the long, cold descent into stillness. Even now, Everest's death zone claims experienced climbers each season, often not through error, but because the body's limits remain absolute. No training or expertise overrides the biology of oxygen starvation, organ collapse, or silent swelling in the brain and lungs. As more attempt the summit, the death rate above 8,000 meters holds steady, a stark reminder: human ambition will always meet its boundary. The mountain does not forgive what the body cannot endure. On May 21st, 2024, 200 climbers bottlenecked near the Hillary Step, as Daniel Patterson and Pass Tenji faced the summit's most infamous choke point. There was no safe way forward, just the no third option that Everest now forces on too many. In this investigation, 5 deaths expose not recklessness, but a system of impossible choices: crowding, silent abandonment, oxygen as currency, profit over truth, and the final line between couldn't and chose not to. Who is truly responsible, and how many will die before the industry changes? At 8,800 meters, the world narrows to a single line of footprints carved into a ridge of snow and ice. The temperature hovers at minus 36 degrees Celsius. Wind is calm, but the air is thin enough to blur thought and slow every movement. On May 21st, 2024, Daniel Patterson and Tenji Sherpa joined a queue of climbers inching down from Everest's summit. Behind them, ahead of them, more than 200 people stretched along the southeast ridge, each clipped to a fixed rope anchored in the snow. The route here is less than 1 meter wide, a cornice overhanging the abyss of the Kangshung face, formed by snow blown and packed over years. Beneath the surface, the cornice is hollow, fragile, and ready to break under too much weight. Traffic had been building since before dawn. Operators timed their summit pushes for the same narrow weather window. Expeditions, each with their own clients, funneled into the same bottleneck. The Hillary Step, once a rock wall, is now a jumbled ramp of snow and stone after the 2015 earthquake. But the real barrier is the human one, a line of climbers, all exhausted, all moving at the pace of the slowest ahead. Every minute spent waiting at this altitude is a minute closer to hypothermia, oxygen depletion, or fatal error. The summit ridge offers no shelter, no room to rest, and no way to turn around without risking a fall. Eyewitnesses describe the moment as a slow-motion crisis. Patterson and Tenji, finding the queue stalled, made the decision that so many have faced, to unclip from the fixed rope and try to pass on the outside edge of the cornice. It is an impossible choice: wait and risk collapse from cold and exhaustion, or step into the unknown, trusting that the snow beneath your feet will hold. For guides like Tenji, the pressure is doubled: responsibility for a client's life and for their own, with no authority to stop the rush of climbers behind. The cornice gave way without warning. Both men disappeared in an instant, swept thousands of meters down the Kangshung face. 4 others, still clipped to the rope, managed to pull themselves back onto the ridge. There was no chance for rescue, no time for last words. The radio fell silent. Within minutes, the line of climbers reformed, inching forward, the gap where Patterson and Tenji had stood quickly swallowed by the moving queue. There is no third option at the summit choke point. The system, permits, operator schedules, fixed ropes, offers only 2. Wait and risk dying in place, or gamble everything on a dangerous pass. The deaths of Daniel Patterson and Tenji Sherpa are not the result of recklessness, but of a design that leaves no safe exit. The ridge remains, unchanged, waiting for the next impossible decision. Permits on Everest are treated as tickets, not as a system of control. In 2024, Nepal issued over 400 permits for the South Col route alone, each costing around $15,000 in government and agency fees. There is no mandated limit on how many climbers can attempt the summit on a given day, nor any requirement that operators coordinate their summit pushes. Instead, expeditions watch the weather and race to fit their clients into the same narrow window of good conditions. The result is a single crowded line moving through the death zone, each person's safety dependent not only on their own choices, but on the decisions made by the hundreds around them. The search for Daniel Patterson and Tenji Sherpa ended after 5 days. The cost of a single high-altitude search on the Kangshung face reached 600,000 rupees, an expense that falls to families and operators, not the state, and one that few can afford to sustain. But the real price is paid before any rescue attempt begins. The system creates a bottleneck at the summit ridge, where the only way out is forward or back along a path already choked with climbers. No policy requires operators to stagger their teams. No regulator enforces a daily cap. The mountain's most fragile features, like the cornice above the Kangshung face, are left to bear the weight of decisions made far below. Vinayaka Malla, an experienced guide who witnessed the 2024 collapse, later described the ridge as a place where every step is a calculation of risk, of trust in the snow beneath, of faith in the system that allowed so many to gather in one place at once. He called the traffic organized, but Organization without oversight is not safety. The permit process rewards volume, not coordination. Operators fill their rosters, the government collects its revenue, and the only check on numbers is the mountain itself. The absence of summit caps is not an oversight. It is a deliberate policy choice. The logic is simple. More permits mean more income, both for the state and for the companies that compete to deliver clients to the top. But the consequences are felt at 8,800 meters, where the margin for error is measured in heartbeats. Every climber waiting in that line is gambling with time, oxygen, and the hope that the ridge will hold. The deaths of Patterson and Pastenji are not isolated tragedies. They are the predictable result of a system that leaves no room for prevention, only for reaction. Until the rules change, the summit choke point will remain a place of impossible choices, and the cost will be counted in lives as well as rupees. At 8,800 meters, the line between rational decision and fatal error dissolves. Joshua Kirui, a 40-year-old Kenyan climber, pressed on toward Everest's summit without supplemental oxygen, a choice that multiplies risk, but one that some climbers see as the purest test. His guide, Nawang Sherpa, stayed close, carrying an emergency oxygen bottle in case the gamble failed. Above the south summit, the world shrinks to the sound of breathing and the static crackle of a radio. The last confirmed contact came near Bishop Rock, just below the summit. Reports indicate Nawang radioed base camp. Kirui was deteriorating, showing abnormal behavior, classic signs of hypoxia, disorientation, confusion, slurred speech, and a stubborn refusal to turn back. At this altitude, oxygen saturation drops below 60%. The brain starves, judgment falters. Base camp relayed instructions: persuade Kirui to descend. But persuasion is a thin thread in the death zone. Hypoxia strips away not just physical strength, but the very capacity to recognize danger or accept help. Kirui, even after using emergency oxygen, refused to turn around. The radio fell silent. No transcript exists, only the knowledge that a guide was asking for authority to act, and a system that offered no clear answer. The dilemma is not unique to this day or this team. Guides on Everest are trained to watch for hypoxia, but have no written protocol for what to do when a client refuses descent. Industry standards suggest that above 8,000 meters, a climber's judgment is too impaired for true consent. Yet, in practice, the decision is left to the guide, who is both employee and guardian, but never the final authority. For Sherpas like Nawang, the choice is agonizing. To abandon a client is a profound dishonor, both professionally and culturally. To stay is to risk their own life. The abandonment trap is built into the system. Leave, and you may face blame or lawsuits. Stay, and you may not come back. There is no right answer, only a set of impossible choices, made in a place where the air itself is an enemy. Kirui's body was found in a crevasse just below the summit. Nawang remains missing. The radio, once a lifeline, became a record of a system that leaves guides to carry the weight of consent, responsibility, and loss, alone, in the thinnest air on Earth. No written protocol governs what a guide must do when a client lost to hypoxia refuses to descend. On Everest, this absence is not just a technical gap. It is the silent engine behind tragedies like Joshua Kirui and Nawang Sherpa. Operators issue radios, oxygen bottles, and contracts, but leave the most critical decisions to the moment when judgment is already failing. Above 8,000 meters, the line between autonomy and incapacity blurs. Yet the system asks guides to respect a client's wishes, even when those wishes are shaped by oxygen-starved confusion. Sherpas occupy a space between employee and guardian, but never true authority. Under Nepali law, guides are liable as workers. Operators shield themselves with waivers and vague risk disclaimers. No industry standard spells out when a guide may or must abandon a client who refuses life-saving intervention. Instead, the decision is pushed down the chain, away from managers and regulators, onto the shoulders of the person least empowered to bear it. For Nawang, the cultural code is clear. To leave a client in the death zone is a stain that follows a Sherpa home. But to stay is to gamble with their own life, sometimes with no real hope of rescue for either. Operators promise safety, but their practices rely on unwritten expectations. Some international teams claim to enforce mandatory turnarounds or guide vetoes. But on the commercial routes, especially with budget operators, the reality is far looser. Clients pay for autonomy, and the permit system rewards volume over caution. The only explicit emergency measure is the 2-liter oxygen bottle, hardly enough to reverse the course of severe hypoxia or buy time for a rescue. When that bottle runs out, the guide is left with nothing but a radio and a moral dilemma. Sherpa unions and safety advocates have pushed for written protocols, clear, enforceable rules that would give guides the authority and the protection to force a descent or, if necessary, to leave a client who cannot be saved. But operators resist, fearing liability and lost business. The government collects its permit fees but does not intervene. The result is a structural abandonment. Guides are left to choose between professional ruin, legal risk, and death, with no written procedure to shield them from blame. The vacuum is not accidental. It is the product of a system designed to maximize summit numbers and revenue while minimizing accountability when the worst happens. Every season, the pattern repeats. Guides like Nawang are forced to make impossible choices in a policy void, with cultural duty pulling one way, survival instincts another, and the law nowhere in sight. Until there is a written standard, a true protocol, the abandonment trap will remain, and the mountain will keep demanding payment in lives. Every climber on Everest measures their safety in liters, not hours. Above 8,000 meters, supplemental oxygen is not just a tool, it is the currency of survival. Jason Kennison began his summit push in May 2023 with a carefully calculated supply. 6 bottles, each holding about 4.2 liters per minute at maximum flow. On paper, this should have been enough for a round trip from Camp 4 to the summit and back, with a slim margin for delays. But on Everest, plans are always provisional. The wind that day reached 70 kilometers per hour at the balcony, scouring the route and making every step a battle. Each gust stripped heat from the body, forcing climbers to turn up their oxygen flow to stay conscious and keep moving. The higher the flow, the faster the bottles drained. What was meant to last 10 hours could be gone in 7. Kennison's team, like most commercial expeditions, had budgeted for normal conditions, not for a prolonged wait in a line of stalled climbers or a sudden spike in wind speed. There was no extra cash waiting at Camp 4, no redundancy, because every bottle costs money. Every kilogram adds risk for the Sherpas who carry them, and every decision is a gamble between cost and safety. As the descent began, Kennison's oxygen ran low. The indicator needle dropped into the red zone. At this altitude, awareness slips quickly. Without supplemental oxygen, blood saturation plummets below 50%. The brain clouds, muscles fail, and the ability to make rational choices disappears. The countdown is not just physical, it is cognitive. Every breath without oxygen is a step closer to confusion, then collapse. Guides and clients alike know this math. Bottles are rationed, sometimes shared, sometimes reserved for the strongest or the most desperate. The ethics of who gets the last bottle are never written down. By the time Kennison reached the balcony, his supply was exhausted. The wind made communication nearly impossible. No resupply could reach him from Camp 4. Conditions were too dangerous for Sherpas to climb back up with spare cylinders. The margin for error had vanished. Kennison collapsed, unable to continue. His death was not a failure of will, but the final result of a system that treats oxygen as a commodity, subject to the same pressures as every other resource on the mountain. On Everest, the depletion countdown is invisible but absolute. Every bottle is a clock, and when it runs out, so do the choices. The question is not just how much oxygen a climber carries, but how much time and how much decision-making capacity they can buy before the mountain takes over. In the death zone, time is measured in liters, and every calculation is a moral one. Every oxygen cylinder carried above 8,000 meters is a calculation. In theory, extra bottles mean extra safety, a buffer against delays, weather, or misjudgment. But on Everest, this safety net is weighed, piece by piece against the cost of getting it to the death zone. For commercial operators, every additional kilogram carried by a Sherpa comes with a price. In 2023, the surcharge for a single oxygen cylinder, 12 kilograms when full, could add hundreds of dollars to an expedition's logistics bill. Multiply that by a dozen clients, and the economics become clear. Redundancy is expensive, and failure is a risk that gets budgeted just like food or tents. A manager's memo from that season spells out the logic. No spare cylinders unless requested and paid for in advance. Weight surcharge, 12 kilograms per bottle. The message is not unique to one operator. It echoes across the industry. Budgets are tight, competition is fierce, and clients, many of whom have already spent upwards of $50,000, are rarely eager to pay more for a safety margin they may never use. Expeditions plan for the expected, not the possible. The line between enough and not enough is drawn by spreadsheets, not by the realities of the death zone. For the Sherpas who shoulder these loads, the calculation is even starker. Each additional bottle is another 12 kilograms to haul through the icefall, up the Lhotse face, and across the South Corn. The risks compound with every trip. Operators, eager to keep costs down and margins up, often limit loads to what is strictly necessary for the planned ascent and descent. There is no standard requiring a spare for every climber, no regulation mandating a reserve at Camp 4. The decision is left to the market, and the market rewards efficiency over excess. When a client runs out of oxygen high on the mountain, the consequences are immediate and often irreversible. Guides may ration their own supply or choose who gets the last bottle. The ethics of these choices are rarely discussed in pre-climb briefings, but they play out in real time, under conditions where judgment is already impaired. In the aftermath of Jason Kennison's death, some operators quietly began to offer optional, redundant cylinder packages for a fee, but the underlying logic remains. On Everest, safety is a commodity, and the price is set far below the true cost of a life lost to a depleted tank. The financial logic behind these shortages is not hidden. It is written into the very structure of commercial climbing on Everest. Every kilogram has a price, and every decision about what to carry is a bet against disaster. Until that equation changes, until safety margins are treated as non-negotiable, not optional extras, the mountain will continue to expose the cost of spare weight and who is left to pay it. Saraswati Tamang Karki had worked in the Khumbu for years, a local resident supporting the Everest economy from the ground up. In the spring of 2021, as climbers returned to base camp after the pandemic closure, she became one of the first non-climbers to fall seriously ill. Her symptoms matched the virus that had swept the world: fever, cough, shortness of breath. But on the mountain, the official story was different. The Everest climbing season had just reopened, bringing in more than 400 foreign climbers and millions of dollars in permit revenue. The stakes for the Nepali government and operators were enormous. Inside the medical tent at base camp, doctors recorded a steady stream of patients. By mid-May, the logbook showed nearly 100 suspected COVID buzz. Helicopters lifted out the worst, 10, maybe more, headed for hospitals in Kathmandu. Yet, when journalists asked about the outbreak, officials denied any formal reports. The Department of Tourism insisted that no cases had been confirmed, that what outsiders called an outbreak was only a handful of altitude-related illnesses. On the ground, the reality was impossible to ignore. Expedition leaders whispered about positive tests, entire teams isolating in tents, and climbers too sick to continue. Sherpas and local workers, like Karki, had no such options. Many kept working, exposed to the same risks as the clients they served. When Karki's condition worsened, her family and friends tried to carry her down the valley, hoping she would reach a clinic in time. She died en route before ever making it to a hospital. The numbers tell the story the officials would not. Reuters reported at least 100 cases at base camp that season, based on interviews with doctors, guides, and evacuation pilots. Medical staff kept their own notes, quietly tallying patients while the government maintained its silence. The gap between what was happening on the mountain and what was being admitted in Kathmandu grew wider by the day. The denial was not accidental. With more than $5 million in permit fees at risk, the incentive to minimize the crisis was overwhelming. The official line, "No outbreak, no need for alarm," became a shield for the season's profits. But the cost of that denial was paid by people like Karki, whose work made the Everest machine run, but whose health and life were treated as secondary to the business of summiting. The numbers remained hidden, the truth buried beneath the surface, as the climbing season pushed forward and the revenue kept flowing. Permit revenue on Everest is not an abstract figure. In 2021, as the COVID outbreak spread through base camp, the Nepali government collected more than ₹500 million in permit fees, over $5 million in a single season. That sum underwrote not only the climbing infrastructure, but also the silence that followed. Official statements dismissed reports of infection as rumors, even as medical tents filled with patients and helicopters ferried the sick out of camp. The logic was simple. Admitting an outbreak could threaten the season, and with it, a year's worth of income for the government, operators, and the local economy. For workers like Saraswati Taman Karki, the calculation was far more personal. Her family remembers the day she fell ill, how quickly her cough deepened, how she tried to keep working, how there was no formal mechanism to request an airlift. Evacuation by helicopter was reserved for foreign clients, whose insurance would cover the cost. Local staff, even those showing clear signs of COVID, were left to descend on foot or be carried by friends. Karki's sister later spoke of the helplessness, knowing that a helicopter sat idle at base camp, but that for a cook from the Khumbu, it might as well have been on another planet. The system that made Everest possible in 2021 depended on denying the reality unfolding at its base. Expeditions continued, climbers posted summit photos, and the official case count remained zero. The government's statements, echoed by operator briefings, framed the outbreak as an altitude illness problem, an explanation that protected the season's profits but left workers exposed. The message was clear. The health of those who made the summit possible was less important than the uninterrupted flow of revenue. This suppression of truth was not an accident, but a feature of a system that treats Everest as an economic engine first and a place of risk second. The incentive to minimize, to deny, to keep the numbers hidden is built into the business model. Each permit is a promise of income. Each admission of crisis is a threat to that promise. The result is a profound erosion of trust, not just between climbers and officials, but between the mountain's workers and the system that claims to support them. Karki's death is not just a tragedy for her family. It is a warning about what happens when profit is allowed to outweigh transparency and care. The season continued, the money flowed, and the official record remained clean. But for those who live and work in the shadow of Everest, the cost of that silence is measured in more than rupees. It is counted in lives, in trust, and in the knowledge that when health and revenue collide on the world's highest mountain, the truth is often the first casualty. On the night of May 23, 1998, the high camp above 8,000 meters became a crossroads of hope and futility. Francis Arsentiev was found alive but barely conscious, sprawled in the snow near the fixed ropes on the northeast ridge. Her face was frostbitten, her speech slurred by the cold and lack of oxygen. Rescue teams counted 4 separate attempts to move her down the mountain. Each time, the effort ran into the same wall. Not enough manpower, not enough rope, and not enough oxygen to keep the rescuers themselves alive. The first group to reach her, a team of Uzbek climbers, tried to lift her, but at that altitude, every step costs more than most people can give. Their own oxygen supplies were nearly empty. Without a spare cylinder, they could not linger. The attempt left them exhausted and forced them to retreat, leaving Francis behind with a promise to send help. Later, Anatoly Bukrev and his partner arrived. Bukrev, already weakened from his own summit push, tried to administer oxygen and encourage her to stand. She was unable to walk. The team debated, stay and risk another death, or move on and save themselves. They left a bottle of oxygen and descended, haunted by the decision. As night fell, another group reached her position. The wind was picking up, temperatures dropping fast. The fixed ropes were iced over, and the route below was steep and exposed. Hauling a climber down from 8,500 meters is not just a question of will. Without a full team, specialized gear, and plenty of oxygen, it is physically impossible. The rescuers watched their own oxygen gauges drop towards zero. They wrapped Frances in a sleeping bag, left her with what little they could spare, and continued down. By the time the last rescue party arrived, the mountain had taken its toll. Frances was unresponsive. The rescuers, themselves at the limit of survival, could do nothing but mark her position and descend before they too became casualties. Sergei Arsentiev, her husband, had already disappeared, lost while trying to bring help back up the ridge. The night was long and silent. Above 8,000 meters, the rules are different. Every kilogram of rope or oxygen is a calculation in survival. The system offers no margin for error, no backup plan for a rescue that drags on past sunset. As dawn broke, Frances was still there, visible to the next wave of climbers, a living reminder that on Everest, the boundary between couldn't and chose not to is razor thin. The only real ethical lever is prevention. Once the crisis begins, there are no good choices left, only the arithmetic of exhaustion, altitude, and time running out. Everest's dead do not simply vanish into legend. Their stories linger, shaping every decision made on the mountain. Frances Arsentiev's body, exposed for nearly a decade on the northeast ridge, forced climbers to stare down the reality of what happens when rescue fails. Her fate, and those of others, left a question that refuses to fade. If help can't reach you, what must change before the disaster strikes? In 2003, commercial operators introduced the turnaround rule, a hard summit cutoff, usually 11 a.m. No matter how close, climbers were to turn back. It was the first real attempt to put prevention ahead of bravado, but it was voluntary, scattered, and lacked any real enforcement. The mountain stayed open to anyone with the means, and the line between misfortune and misjudgment blurred with every new casualty. The aftermath is a patchwork of reforms, some enacted, many ignored. 5 proposals now stand as the baseline demanded by guides, survivors, and reformers. First, a coordinated daily summit cap, enforced by the Nepali government, to prevent the deadly bottlenecks that trapped Patterson and Pas Tenji. Second, mandatory redundant oxygen reserves, so every climber and guide carries a spare cylinder, not as a luxury, but as a minimum standard. Third, written, enforceable protocols, granting guides the authority and legal protection to order a descent when a client is incapacitated by hypoxia, closing the abandonment trap that claimed Nawang Sherpa. Fourth, standardized operator procedures for managing traffic, including staggered summit windows and real-time team communication, so the summit ridge never again becomes a single, fragile queue. Fifth, an independent oversight board of veteran Sherpas, medical experts, and government officials, empowered to audit, sanction, and revoke permits from operators who cut corners or hide risks. These reforms are not abstract. Each one answers a death that should have been prevented. The 2003 turnaround rule has saved lives, but only when followed. Redundant oxygen could have saved Jason Kennison. Guide authority might have spared Kirui and Nawang. Traffic management and caps could have kept Patterson and Pas Tenji from disaster. Oversight would have forced honesty during the COVID outbreak that killed Saraswati Tamankarki. The memory of Frances Arsentiev demands more than mourning. It demands a system that values prevention, lives, and truth above all else. Until these reforms are enforced, Everest remains a place where impossible choices are routine. Everest's deadly calculus remains unchanged. Every summit season, the no third option returns, and business as usual means more impossible choices. In 2023, permit numbers hit a record high, yet the systems meant to protect climbers lag behind. Moral ambiguity isn't a bug, it's a feature of the industry. Until prevention trumps profit, the death zone will keep demanding answers no summit can provide. What would you change if it meant saving a life?